Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. I hope you had a great week. As always, Let's Talk Micro is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Overcast, Pandora, TuneIn Radio. Wherever you listen to your podcast, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As far as social media, I am on Instagram as Let's Talk Micro, no apostrophe, and on Twitter as Let's Talk Micro 1. So please go ahead and follow. I always like to post pictures of organisms, updates as to when the next episode is coming out. So you can always follow, leave any feedback, any suggestions about possible podcast topics. So please feel free and go ahead and follow. If you haven't checked out last week's episode, please go ahead and do so. It was a very great episode. It was an interview episode where Dr. Jeanette Teo from the National University Hospital in Singapore, she came to the podcast and she was talking about a new member of the Staphylococcus aureus complex, which is Staphylococcus singaporensis. In January, I had an interview with Dr. Robin Patel and Dr. Audrey Schutz from the Mayo Clinic, and they were talking about a study with some isolates that they were originally identified as Staph aureus. They ultimately ended up being identified as Staphylococcus argenteus, the silver staph. So it is very similar to Staph aureus, right, as far as catalase, coagulase positive, beta hemolysis. The only difference was that it even has some virulence factors, some evidence of it being a colonizer, but the difference was that it doesn't have the yellow pigment, the staphyloxanthin gene. It doesn't have it, so that's what they call it, like the silver staph. And on last week's episode, Dr. Teo, she talks about a study they did. There were some isolates that they were originally identified as Staphylococcus argenteus, but there were some differences. They weren't quite similar. So via gene sequencing, they found out that they are different. And the new species, it was named Staphylococcus singaporensis. So go ahead and check out that episode. We talk about virulence factors, how similar this organism is to Staph aureus. It seems that this one does have the staphyloxanthin gene. So we go over all that. One of the challenges now is that, argenteus was identified via gene sequencing, singaporensis 2. As of right now, the Bruker-Molditov can identify Staphylococcus argenteus, but not singaporensis yet. So that's one of the challenges where now all the Molditov platforms, they need to start updating, their databases, so we can start identifying these organisms in the lab. This way, if we start identifying them, we can know more about them. We can have a better understanding as far as, what's the pathogenesis, whether, they're colonizers, what kind of susceptibility profiles we have. So these are things that we have to keep in mind. And of course, we need to start by being able to identify the organisms. So it was a good interview. If you haven't checked it out, go ahead and do so. The episode is episode 38, Staphylococcus singaporensis. So today's episode is another interview episode. This is some great information. So here I have, in this interview, I have 3 guests, and they are coming to discuss a study which was published in the Journal of Clinical Microbiology of the American Society for Microbiology. And then the article is titled, "Stop Waiting for Tomorrow. This diffusion performed on early growth is an accurate method for antimicrobial susceptibility. Testing will reduce turnaround time." So I get 3 guests, which are Dr. Carey-Ann Burnham, Dr. Daniel Webber, and Meghan Wallace from the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. As microbiologists, we know that microbiology, One of the differences from between microbiology and other areas of the lab, like hematology, chemistry, it is time, right? If you're in hematology or in chemistry, let's say your sample is hemolyzed, your for your chemistry, your CBC is clotted, you go ahead and call for a new sample, and then you run it through the instrument, and then within 1 hour, you can have your result. So we know that in micro, this is not the case. Yeah, of course, we have some rapid tests, like your rapid straps, you have some PCR testing. But when it comes to bacterial cultures, it's a lengthy process. It's time consuming. We have to wait till the organism grows about 18 to 24 hours. Then after that, if it's a pathogen, based on the source, we go ahead and, perform ID and susceptibilities. If we don't have enough to perform those, we have to subculture the organism and then wait another day or so we can perform susceptibilities. So microbiology is all about time. If you don't streak your plate, if you don't find that bacteria and you don't isolate it, or maybe it's a slow grower, so everything is a day. You isolate the organism, it's 1 day, susceptibilities, another day. So this is all about time. What about if we didn't have to wait those 18 hours? What if we could incubate the organism for less time and then perform susceptibilities, right? We could provide results faster to the provider so the patient could be treated, accordingly. So this is what the study was about. They went ahead and performed susceptibilities on organisms that they were, incubated for 6 hours. So, think about it when in the lab, you either, you subculture an organism, or let's say you plate some media with your swab from the sample that came in the lab. And then, right, you incubate that plate for 18 to 24 hours. And then from there, if you have enough, like I said, you perform your ID susceptibilities. So in this case, the plate was inoculated and then it was incubated for 6 hours. And then from those colonies, some of these common organisms that you see in the lab, they use control organisms and they use also their samples, organisms like E. coli, Staph aureus. After that 6 hours, they grab some colonies, they perform their diffusion, and then they compare those results to this diffusion, testing that was incubated for the regular 24 hours. So the results were were actually very satisfactory. They obtained some really good results. So this looks promising. And of course, there are some variables that this will, of course, it will work better with your automated lines where there's limited access to the incubators. So there are some things that need to be figured out, but this data looks really good. It is exciting to think that maybe, this working, we can actually reduce the time, that it takes us in the lab to provide susceptibilities. This is all about the patients. Anything that we can do to improve, it's always welcome. So without further ado, let's go ahead and listen to the interview. So today is an interview episode, and we have 3 guests. They are the authors of a study performed on disc diffusion, and this was published on the Journal of Clinical Microbiology of the American Society for Microbiology. And the title is Stop Waiting for Tomorrow. Disc diffusion performed on early growth is an accurate method for antimicrobial susceptibility testing with reduced turnaround time. So today with me, I have Dr. Carey-Ann Burnham, Dr. Daniel Webber, and Meghan Wallace from the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Thank you so much for having us here today.
Thank you.
You're certainly welcome. Okay, so let's just start going around the room, and can each of you please tell me a bit about yourself and your current role?
Sure, absolutely. Again, thank you for having us here today. We're really excited to talk to you about our study. My name is Carey-Ann Burnham, and I'm a professor of pathology and immunology at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also the medical director of our microbiology laboratory at Barnes-Jewish Hospital. And in addition to those roles, I lead a research group. I think I'm pretty lucky. I work with the best research team in the business, and I love all things bacteriology and antimicrobial resistance.
I'm Daniel Webber, and I'm an instructor in the same department at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm currently studying microbiome. I had the pleasure to work with Dr. Burnham and Meghan during this study while I was a clinical pathologist or resident in clinical pathology.
Hi, my name is Meghan Wallace. I'm a certified medical lab scientist. I got my start in a clinical micro lab at a children's hospital, but for the past 9 years, I've worked in a clinical microbiology research lab of Carey-Ann.
Very nice. A fellow medical lab scientist. Okay, can you tell me a bit about your clinical lab?
Absolutely, I will take this one. So our clinical laboratory is a so-called hub microbiology laboratory for our healthcare system. So we serve the large academic medical center. It's about 1,250 beds, a standalone children's hospital, and several community hospitals. So overall, we serve over 3,000 inpatient beds. I think we're pretty lucky because our laboratory is newly constructed. We moved into it in 2016, so it's new. It's not in the basement. It's on the 5th floor. We even have windows, so that's really a treat. And we're pretty lucky to be outfitted with a lot of great technology. We have the Keystra Total Laboratory Automation System. We were some of the first in the country to be using MALDI-TOF for microbial identification. We've been using that for about a decade. We use the virtual blood culture system. But despite my love of new technology and rapid diagnostics, our major workhorse for susceptibility testing is Kirby-Bauer disc diffusion, which is surprising to some people.
Wow, definitely nice to be working in a new facility. That's definitely very nice. Just out of curiosity, before I ask the next question, which MALDI-TOF do you use over there?
We have the Bruker biotyper for our clinical operation, but in the research operation that Meghan is part of, we have the Vitek MS. So we're really lucky that we get to work with both of them on a regular basis.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I only work with the Vitek MS. I haven't worked with the Bruker. So with this study, what question were you asking and what prompted you to ask this question?
Take this one. So we really want to know if we could speed things up. As Dr. Burnham mentioned, the mainstay of antimicrobial susceptibility testing in the lab is Kirby-Bauer disc diffusion testing. And so we wanted to ask specifically whether susceptibility results are comparable if subcultures were incubated for a shorter period of time, such as like 6 or 10 hours, versus a standard 18 to 24 hours before disc diffusion testing.
And I think there's a lot of things that prompted us to ask this question. And I think a big driver is the fact that microlabs are no longer just so-called day shift operations like they used to be in the past. So with micro becoming more consolidated and labs serving as hub labs with things like total lab automation, where samples go in on a continuous flow and are ready to be read on a continuous flow, I think we really need to get away from our historical microbiology mindset that you do a bunch of stuff, put it in the incubator, and then come back the next day and work on it. So this is where we really were trying to think about how could we push the limits of Kirby-Bauer disc diffusion to have a cost-effective but accurate way of delivering results faster.
Okay, and then so while we're at this, can you tell the audience the importance of improving antimicrobial susceptibility testing results?
Absolutely. You know, this is something that I'm really passionate about. The antimicrobial resistance crisis is a huge public health crisis, and a lot of it is fueled by diagnostic uncertainty. So because we have so much antimicrobial resistance, when people present to the hospital and they look sick and suggestive of infection, we're really forced to treat them with broad spectrum antimicrobials up front because of the risk that it could be a resistant pathogen. And so during this long window of diagnostic uncertainty, sometimes 2 or 3 days, the patients remain on these broad spectrum antimicrobials, which only goes on to further cause more selective pressure and further fuel the antibiotic resistance crisis. And so the more quickly that we can deliver optimal antimicrobial susceptibility testing, we can have patients put on optimal therapy, we can preserve our big gun antimicrobials for when we really need the big gun. And then of course, reduce healthcare costs. And then thinking about Daniel's interest in the microbiome, try to not do too much damage on the microbiome, hammering it with all the broad spectrum antimicrobials.
And on Carey-Ann's point, I also want to bring up the bench tech point of view and how it can be feasible in a lab. It's super important for any test that's being brought into the lab to be easily integrated. And one plus for disk diffusion, as Carey-Ann mentioned, is that it's fairly inexpensive and it's something that any lab can adopt. It doesn't require any extra equipment. And as we stated before, a lot of labs are going to 24-hour shifts, even for micro. So it allows reading on multiple shifts. And so from a bench tech standpoint, it can be easily brought in pretty much anywhere.
Okay, yes. And definitely one of the things in micro from also my experiences when working on the bench, it's so different from other areas of the lab. So definitely in micro, it's all about time. If you don't sub out the organism, if you don't, you have to isolate it, it costs you a day, and then you set it up and that's another day. And so it's like, we kind of have to stay one step ahead and start thinking, maybe I should throw this media in case I get this organism. That way I can save myself a day. Or maybe the patient has a history of being an MDRO. So let me go ahead and throw the reflex just in case. That way I don't waste a day. So definitely micro, it's all about time.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so on the study, what types of microorganisms did you evaluate, and what was the method?
Yeah, sure. So we evaluated a wide range of things in terms of resistance profiles, such as both MRSA and MSSA, VRE, as well as VSE. And then we did, common organisms that you'll see around a clinical lab. So we, as I mentioned, MRSA, MSSA, but E. coli, Klebsiella. And we not only looked at these common microorganisms that are in the clinical lab, but we looked at them with 2 shortened incubation periods. So subcultures grown for 6 hours or 10 hours compared to the standard 18 to 24 hours. And that allowed us to see what the concordance was in terms of the results from the disk diffusion test, as well as the classification of those results as susceptible versus resistant.
And I can talk about the method a little bit. So we started by just stringing organisms to a blood agar and incubated them overnight. From those plates, we made a 0.5 McFarlane, and we took that McFarlane and plated 100 microliters to 3 separate blood agar plates. Each of those were incubated for either 6, 10, or 24 hours. Once they were done incubating, we set up AST according to CLS guidelines set in the M100. Just in brief, for those who maybe haven't set up a Kirby Bauer, it's a 0.5 McFarlane that we streak along a growth onto a Mueller-Hinton agar and drop antibiotic discs. We incubated those and read those at time points that were appropriate for the bug-drug combination, also set by the M100, which is between 16 or 24 hours for what we tested.
So I just have a question. As I was reading the study, and so why the 100 microliter suspension why was that used to inoculate the blood agar plates?
So really the main reason we wanted to do the 100 microliters is just to standardize all of our experiments.
Okay, definitely, yeah, makes sense.
I think it's a good question, right? Because in real life, things can have a variety of different inocula, but just to make sure we were standardizing to really evaluate it, we put that into the equation.
Okay, yes, I understand. Yeah, because typically we do either from, make the suspension from picking up the colonies, for the audience, or I also use there's a prompt system where you touch the colonies and put that on the saline, and then that you use to set up your susceptibilities. Okay, thank you. So in this study, what worked well and what were the challenges?
Yeah, I'll take that one. It was nice. What we saw is that there were no growth failures. Even though 6 hours is a fairly short incubation period for a subculture, we had adequate colonies at that point in time to proceed with this diffusion testing. So that was encouraging. And then we went on and saw that accuracy, once we performed this diffusion testing, from early versus normal subculture times. Accuracy is really good, surprisingly good. And not only was it good for QC organisms, but when we really tried to kick the tires and use a broad set of clinical isolates, we saw that across different bugs and drugs and the combination of those two, that there was a good concordance between the standard method, the standard time, and the shortened subculture time.
And for our challenges, I think probably our biggest challenge was with supplies. We did a lot of testing during the pandemic. And as anyone who works in a clinical lab knows, there's been a lot of delays and back orders on some of our standard culture media, discs, tubes, any supply. So having the correct media and antibiotic discs when we needed them and enough to set up all 3 time points was a challenge. I think probably our only other challenge was timing. So Daniel and I, when we were doing these experiments, really wanted to make sure that we set up everything for each organism from the same subculture. So we would need to be available to set up the disc diffusion at 6, 10, and 24 hours, as well as read all 3 of them at the correct time points. Big props to Daniel, who took the brunt of the very early and very late shifts. For that, I'm incredibly thankful.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so that's definitely, obviously with the pandemic, yeah, the supplies has been definitely very challenging, from everything from media. When they started making tests for COVID, like some of these companies, they started scaling back on the other ones. So we had like huge backlogs of, tests like, like Neisseria and chlamydia, PCR. Then a lot of times, you place your order and then, this agar is back ordered, and so is this one. Yes, and talking about the study, yes, that's always one of the challenges when, especially if you're setting up the organisms and then the next day you happen to be off, and then, you have to either coordinate with a coworker and kind of hope that it gets done, because if you miss it, then it sets you back. Okay, so as I was reading this study, just this question came to mind. Why does the disc diffusion method has more limited use in the United States?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think a lot of it really comes down to regional customs. So in the US, the custom has been more to use a commercial automated susceptibility testing system. It's my opinion, the major reason for that is that we have prioritized the convenience of that and the workflow that goes with that. Kirby-Bauer is notorious for having longer hands-on time. It's a more manual method. In addition, while a Kirby-Bauer generates zone sizes, it does not generate minimum inhibitory concentration values. And some people put a lot of emphasis or value on getting an MIC number. I'm one of the people in the camp that doesn't value that number as much because, in the clinical lab, we know that every MIC, the allowable variation is plus or minus 1 doubling dilution. So your 1 can be 0.5 or it can be 2. And I think it's important we don't overinterpret that number. So clearly I'm a fan of disc diffusion. I already told you it's the major method. We use it in our lab. And people often ask me why, and they're often surprised given our other amount of technology that it's our method. But just to share with you some of the things I think are really important about it. One is that it's very flexible. We can design what we want our panels to look like. We can pick which discs are on the panel, and we have a lot of them. So we can be responsive to our patient population and our formulary. In addition, when new antimicrobials are approved, the disc is usually the first test that comes to market. And so we're able to start testing as quickly as possible when we use the disc. And I think as the clinical laboratory, we really have an obligation to do susceptibility testing for new drugs when clinically appropriate, when they're available, because it costs a lot of money to bring a new drug to market. And if we can't provide susceptibility testing, it won't be used. And so that just really further stifles the innovation in that space. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think with things like Keystra and WASP and total lab automation and being able to couple automation with disc diffusion as we move forward, I think it's possible that we may see more labs even in the US moving towards that methodology.
So you mentioned that you use the this diffusion. I mean, does it is it manageable using that method with the volume that you have in your lab?
I think it's easy for me to say because I'm not the one doing it on a day-to-day basis. But it is managed by staffing to it. So we have a separate susceptibility bench, and it's usually staffed by 2 technologists who share the duties. We have 2 instruments called the biomic that help with reading and interpretation of zone sizes. Not everything can be read on the biomic. For example, enterococci that grow more faintly aren't well interpreted with the biomic. And anything that needs to be on Mueller-Hinton with blood can't be put on the biomic, but that definitely helps with our workflow. And even though, again, I think a lot of people think disc diffusion is unsophisticated, it actually takes a lot of talent to be good at setting it up routinely and to interpret it and knowing what discs need to be read, for example, with transmitted light versus reflected light, and when you do and don't read the pinpoints. So it takes a lot of training. So yes, I think it's manageable with the right staffing.
Yes, it definitely makes the difference. Like I work in a very large facility, and when you have, the system is set up like that. Like if you have a high volume and you have maybe someone, reading your positives or like a good division of labor, then it works really great, really well. And you were mentioning, I'm sorry.
Which I just was going to ask, which AST system do you use routinely in your job?
We use it's the Vitek. It's the main method. And then we were using broth microdilution, but that was more for like the NDRO reflexes. So the Vitek is the main one. And you were talking about I guess people liking the MIC values, and that's, it brings to mind that a lot of times, we do perform, let's say that we perform a test, on Kirby Bauer, and then as soon as we put it out, then we get a request, please perform the test, like e-test or so, sometimes, a lot of providers, they do like the MICs.
So I think a lot of this at our shop has come with education, discussion around it. We have buy-in from the antimicrobial stewardship team. So in general, it's not our custom. Our practice isn't based on it. However, for certain key antimicrobials where sometimes the MIC is a driver, we do have backup methods, gradient diffusion, broth microdilution that can be done in selective cases, just not in all circumstances.
Okay. So how do you anticipate your results? How might they be incorporated into routine clinical use? And let's start with that question. I'll ask the next one.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question, right? Because in a busy clinical lab, like you know about, operators are not just standing by at 6 hours to streak plates. So there is the sort of research setting where we can standardize everything, which Megan and Daniel described well. And then there's the real world. So in the real world, where I think this will have the most utility is on positive blood culture broths. So for example, in our lab, positive blood culture broths, after the gram stain is made and aliquot is put into a tube and is put on the Keystra system, it's plated, and the first images are taken at 8 hours. With Keystra, the plates always being in the optimal incubation atmosphere and temperature, the colonies grow great. For most regular bacteria, you have very robust growth at 8 hours. And so this is where I think one can really best incorporate the method that we described in our paper. Also, we know blood cultures typically only grow one organism, while up to 10% can be polymicrobial. They're usually monomicrobial. So it's really well positioned for this. Where I don't think we would use it is something like a urine, because we all know if you start to work up a urine culture at 6 hours, one, you're just going to overcall contamination. It's going to be mixed and you're going to be doing a lot of rework. I also think it could be helpful for things like CSF, although I didn't mention that out of the gates because thankfully very few CSFs are positive anymore. So that's a much less common specimen type.
Okay. So yeah, that was going to be my next question, and it was answered. So yes, probably sources where typically you have one organism will be more ideal. Definitely like blood cultures, like you were mentioning. It is always my experience, and it's in blood cultures when I'm reading them, it's either there's no middle ground. It's either a good day where you have clear-cut Staph aureus, E. coli, or a really bad day when they are polymicrobial, and then you are trying to separate, and maybe the instrument, there was some limitation where it produced an ID, but the organism is not growing. So definitely there's no middle ground there. Have any more studies been performed after this one?
So that is a great question. And the answer is no, not yet. But the dream study is to really look at what the real world implementation looks like. So putting the method into the wild, really seeing what the turnaround time difference is, step one. Asking the question how often they have to be repeated or discarded because of, for example, mixtures. And then the even more important question, what is the clinical impact? Was prescribing practice changed or were antimicrobials altered based on the more rapid results? So I'm cautiously optimistic that those studies and that data will be forthcoming.
Okay, yeah, and the outcome of the study, the numbers were actually pretty good from what I saw. So, and then yes, definitely, and then if this, yeah, then like the labs, they will have to implement some sort of system, like maybe perhaps because if they don't have an automated line, where there's limited access to the plates, then they will have to devise some sort of system where, because like one of the challenges when you don't have an automated line like the Keystra is that the frequent activity, people are opening the incubator all day. Sometimes techs arrive at 6 a.m. and take out all their plates and they sit on the bench for hours. So that's one of the challenges that they will have to work on. I mean, I will think as if they implement this system.
Absolutely. I mean, and maybe even having a separate, smaller incubator that's used just for blood cultures. And there's even a sign on it that says only open the door at certain times. Or, I think there's a lot to work through. Definitely, this workflow is much more amenable to a TLA system, that continuous flow, the incubator door being shut.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to tell the audience about this study?
Daniel, any closing remarks?
No, it was a real fun study to do. And we were really excited that it worked as well as it did with no very major errors or major errors when comparing, the standard method, 18 to 24 hours, with a shortened method of 6 hours of clinical isolate. So, I think that it's something that will make sense for labs that commonly do just diffusion testing to consider implementing.
Megan, any closing thoughts from you?
I mean, I'd really just echo what Daniel said. I thought it was kind of an exciting study, and it's great that you're having us on your show. It just shows interest, and we hope that some people might take this and try and utilize it in their own labs.
It was a lot of fun, and I'm surprised at how well it worked. I thought we would have more growth failures, so it was a surprise in a pleasant way.
Now that you mentioned that about me bringing you on to the podcast, like I was actually on Twitter, I see that like this study, like a lot of people are commenting like very positively. So I was, as I was seeing the comments, I was so excited. I was like, oh, they're coming to my podcast to talk to me. So it's just, it felt great. So it has a lot of positive reviews so far from what I've seen on Twitter and social media.
It's been our pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, well, all three of you, definitely, it's been a pleasure meeting you and talking to you about this. Thank you for taking the time to come into Let's Talk Micro and talk about it.
Thank you for having us. This was really fun.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy listening to this interview. As always, I always enjoy talking to you about all this microbiology stuff, all this interesting studies, all this information. As always, I hope you have a great week. Continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. So please, stay motivated. Stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time, bye.